must be everything to me. Let me find in you all those foreign lands you will not let me visit. Be my philosophy, be my science. My old friend Montaigne, he had a special pity for physical suffering. Pain leads to moral and intellectual growth, but only up to a certain point. So wrote Alphonse Daudet in the late 19th century as this French writer struggled to live with chronic neuropathic pain. The book he left us, In the Land of Pain, could well be titled also, In the Name of Pain, for pain has become all mixed up with Daudet's self-identity. At first glance, pain might be something we'd all agree on. We want to avoid it, whether it be physical, psychological, mental, or spiritual. Medicine's focus on the eradication of pain, chiefly pain of the physical sort, draws attention to it, and efforts to manage or eliminate pain drive biomedical research and consumer markets alike. But is there any less pain as a result? And while we might not like experiencing pain, are there costs associated with thinking of human beings as potentially pain-free? This is not to suggest that people should seek out pain, but rather to question whether avoidance of pain might actually produce more suffering in the form of discrimination against those, often persons with disabilities, whom we believe to be in pain or already suffering too much. What would it mean to name pain not as alien to human existence, but as one of the defining conditions of being human? As it turns out, our attitudes toward pain are complicated, especially when we think we see others in its thrall suffering. So to help sort this out, we're turning today to three experts in disability studies, bioethics, and the cultural study of pain and pain medicine. Tobin Siebers, Parrington Collegiate Professor of English and Art and Design at the University of Michigan, co-chair of Michigan's Disability Studies Initiative, and author of books on disability theory and disability aesthetics, joins us via Skype. This is why he's on the big screen. Welcome, Tobin. Two local scholars will respond to Professor Siebers. The first is David Morris, Emeritus Professor of English and author of The Culture of Pain, a prize-winning book that has influenced both the study of pain and the practice of pain medicine. Second, we'll hear from Lois Shepard, Wallenborn Professor of Biomedical Ethics and Professor of Public Health Sciences and Law, and author of a book about the Terry Schiavo case and lessons from it. UVA's Institute for Practical Ethics and Public Life is our partner in presenting today's program. None of our speakers has disclosed any financial conflict of interest relative to the content of this program. And we welcome Tobin Siebers, time traveling from Ann Arbor, Michigan, to start.
First, I'd like to thank Marcia for putting together the event and David and Lois for responding. But most of all, I'd like to thank the audience for coming. I'm looking forward very much to your ideas and questions. Human beings suffer from sickness, but to suffer from sickness is something of a metaphor. We supposedly suffer from diseases and disabilities, whether they are painful or not. The man standing on the corner pointing the white cane suffers from blindness, but he has no pain in his eyes or anywhere else. The young woman walking to the local deaf club suffers from deafness, but her body does not hurt and she seems perfectly happy. The Iraq War veteran suffers from quadriplegia, although he cannot feel a thing in most of his body. A disabled body is supposedly a body of pain, and pain represents, for most people, a sort of terror and an affront to human dignity. Nothing seems more horrifying to human beings than imagining a lifetime of future suffering. Pain is, however, notoriously subjective. The usual observation notes that it is difficult to share pain, that one person cannot really understand the pain of another. But a second difficulty exists, quite the opposite, and it is rarely discussed. That is, how frequently one person imputes feelings of pain and suffering to another person. In fact, it is astonishing how often one person assumes that another person is in pain based solely on appearance or circumstances. Passers-by approach the man standing on the corner with the white cane and gush about their great admiration for his bravery in the face of suffering and adversity. They blurt out to the young deaf woman that they themselves could not bear such hardship. Complete strangers feel compelled to tell the paralyzed veteran that they would rather be dead than be him. Such reactions may set off feelings of grief in the objects of pity if they are genuinely in pain, but they may just as likely respond with bewilderment over the fact that their happy existence represents a lifetime of suffering to absolute strangers who know nothing about their family, occupation, physical condition, or daily circumstances. Such is the nature of pain in human universe that it triggers instant and with little reflection such powerful emotions, opinions, and judgments. To speak in the name of pain is to resist these bad habits of thought. Pain is a motive force rarely questioned and stunning in its ability to engage us in or disengage us from the lives of other human beings. It raises money for charities. It drives legislation. It starts and ends wars. It justifies the ending of life and the refusal to begin it. It is at the heart of debates about abortion, assisted suicide, wrongful birth, neonatal testing, end-of-life care, right to life, and mercy killing. I speak in the name of pain to reveal that the fear of pain is one of the most pervasive and insidious justifications of disability oppression. Today, disabled people are stigmatized almost everywhere, carved up by doctors in unnecessary surgeries, and lose their life because others wrongly assume that they are in pain. And disabled people who are in pain are subjected to the same horrific treatment because they can mount no argument justifying a life in any way thought by others to be painful. Pain is a force impossible at the present moment to contradict. A painful life is simply considered a life not worth living. A painful life is easily terminated without objection. A painful life is not thought to be a human life, and people with disabilities can be tortured and killed in the name of whatever pain's opposite is. Surely not pleasure, but the collection of concepts that question the variety of any life possessing even the most meager association with pain. The use of pain as a motive force to justify disability oppression is most visible today in headline events. No one knows what harm the fear of pain causes in the more quiet, secluded realm of private life, in the everyday occurrences that do not catch wind in the media and remain hidden in small family dramas, but the damage must be enormous. Headline events are fewer but knowable. They are global, testifying to the fact that pain holds sway over moral and political judgments, irrespective of cultural belief. They are also controversial, fortunately, which sometimes provides the opportunity to think about both sides of a question, opposing those who think that pain must always be the deciding factor in quality of life, to those rare individuals who take a different point of view. A number of years ago in the United States, a firestorm of controversy arose around the case of Seattle's Ashley X, sometimes called the Pillow Angel. Ashley was born with cerebral palsy. She cannot hold her head, change position, walk, or talk. She is supposed to be profoundly cognitively disabled, but her parents say that she is alert, loves music, seems to watch television, vocalizes in response to music and attention, and goes to school. Nevertheless, her parents induced a medical state of permanent pre-puberty in their daughter, age 6, by surgically removing her breast buds and uterus and by placing her on a high dose of estrogen to stunt her growth. They also had her appendix removed. Their goal is to keep Ashley as small as possible, making it easier both to control her and to move her from place to place. And I quote from them, "We call her our pillow angel since she is so sweet and stays right where we place her, usually on a pillow." At the heart of the controversy is the question whether Ashley's parents are rescuing their daughter from pain or abusing her. But pain remains in either case the crucial factor. When in 2006 the parents went public with the Ashley treatment, they found themselves in the middle of a national controversy about the injury of disabled people. Involuntary sterilization and unnecessary surgeries for the convenience of institutions, such as the removal of teeth, have long been discarded as barbaric practices. But Children's Hospital in Seattle carried out the Ashley treatment anyway, eventually admitting 3 years later that its actions were illegal. Activists in the disability community attacked Ashley's parents for violating her human rights and abusing her, and demanded a condemnation of her doctors by the American Medical Association, but no response was forthcoming from either legal or medical authorities. Ashley's parents continue to defend their actions in the name of reducing their daughter's pain, and many people accept their motives because they do pain above all else, and consequently identify with the desire to rescue the young woman from an imagined future life of suffering. The parents claim that they are saving Ashley from the pain of menstrual cramps, that having large breasts is uncomfortable and attracts sexual abuse, that having an appendix places her at a 5% risk of appendicitis, that her low body weight protects her against bed sores, pneumonia, and bladder infections, and that the hysterectomy eliminates, quote, the possibility of uterine cancer and other common and painful complications, unquote, affecting women later in life. Ashley's parents connect explicitly the avoidance of pain and suffering to their daughter's quality of life and stick with confidence that God is on their side. And I quote them again, "The God we know wants Ashley to have a good quality of life. Knowingly allowing avoidable suffering for a helpless and disabled child can't be a good thing in the eyes of God," unquote. Only one commentator, to my knowledge, questions the sincerity of Ashley's parents on the issue of pain. Patricia Williams asks why, if the avoidance of pain is the deciding factor, the parents stop short of performing other invasive medical procedures to protect their daughter against suffering. Quote, "Why not remove all her teeth to spare her the pain of cavities? Why not excise her fingernails to spare her the pain of accidentally scratching herself?" Unquote. Unfortunately, if Ashley's parents had resorted to these procedures, few parents would have likely questioned their motives. So profound is the prejudice against pain. A painful life is a wrongful life. Not many people seem to disagree with this proposition. Indeed, the idea of a wrongful life lies behind practices that range from depriving disabled people of their civil and human rights to those defying their death. In France, the idea of a wrongful life made the headlines when the parents of Nicolas Perouche brought suit against a doctor and medical lab for making mistakes that resulted in his mother choosing to give birth rather than abort him. Josette Perouche discovered early in her pregnancy that her 4-year-old daughter had contracted rubella. She asked her doctor to test her for the disease because it produced several severe disabilities in pregnancy, stating that she preferred to have an abortion if she was exposed. The doctor and laboratory responded incorrectly that the fetus was not infected. Nicolas Perouche was born profoundly incapacitated, deaf, almost blind, with cognitive disabilities. The Perouches sued the doctor and laboratory for malpractice and won the suit. They eventually sued again, this time demanding damages for causing him to be born and asking for the lifetime cost of caring for him. France's Supreme Court ruled in favor of the suit, and although its decision never mentioned the concepts of wrongful birth or wrongful life, the ruling was interpreted as protecting the right not to be born. The judgment was reiterated a year later when the same court found that children with Down syndrome have the legal right to never have been born and could sue doctors for errors that resulted in their birth. At the heart of the wrongful life suits is the idea that plaintiff rights are violated by being born, that people have the right to be terminated before birth to avoid a life pronounced painful and miserable. In effect, the court's ruling confirms a belief in the concept of a wrong life, that is, a life less worthy than others, a life without human dignity, a life not worth living. In the case of disabled people, it seems death is preferable to life. In a world where pain represents the ultimate measure of quality of life, all disabled people risk to have their existence described as wrongful life because disability and suffering are thought synonymous. Disabled lives are routinely described as lives not worth living, lives undeserving of human dignity. Disabled lives, they're also judged as their lives are judged as inferior to death. L'affaire Perouche, as it came to be known in France, provoked an uproar over these ideas, questioning some common perceptions about disability. The court appeared to represent being born with a disability as a wrong in itself, apparently because disability supposes exceptional costs. Jean-François Mattei, head of the conservative Liberal Democratic Party, attacked the decision before the National Assembly, claiming that the court seemed, quote, to validate the principle that the birth of a disabled child would be in itself an anomaly, quote. Jerry Saint-Rose, the Attorney General of France, objected to the decision with precise reasoning. According to the court, he stated, and I cite him, the wrong is the life, and the absence of the wrong is death, unquote. He warned that the ruling would lead to a precautionary eugenics, in introducing discrimination between parents of good biological quality and other parents who should abstain from procreating. He also cautioned that the decision would transform abortion from a choice into an obligation. Christine Boutin, speaking for the Conservative Alliance for Right to Life, agreed that the court decision, quote, confirms France's entry into institutional eugenics, unquote. The disability community in France raised alarms against the decision as well. Quote, "The Perush ruling reveals the total incapacity of our society to see disability as a richness and its rejection of anything that is different," Jean-Christophe Parisot, president of the Collective of Disabled Democrats, explained, and I can continue with this quotation: "We have to break out of this spiral which condemns abnormality and calls human beings mistakes," unquote. In January 2002, the National Assembly passed legislation making the Perush ruling obsolete. The legislation outlaws awarding damages solely as a result of birth and specifies that people with disabilities may seek redress for negligent acts that caused or aggravated their disability. The new law seems like a victory for the disability community, and perhaps it is, but the Supreme Court has subsequently made rulings that permit plaintiffs to sue for lifetime damages against doctors whose malpractice brings to the world disabled children. In the current climate, it is difficult to take one side over the other because both sides lie on the conception of disability as suffering. The French government speaks in the name of disabled people and against their suffering, but it also protects doctors from damages and rising insurance costs. The Supreme Court of France stands against medical and governmental authorities, recognizing that malpractice may result in the birth of disabled children and holding the doctors responsible for the lifetime care of these children rather than limiting damages on purely economic and political grounds. And yet the concept of a wrongful life, necessary to lifetime damages, stigmatizes people with disabilities as living painful lives, less valuable and dignified than those of non-disabled people. A final case, which might be called the case of the century, returns us to the United States and to the tragic death of Terry Schiavo, quote, "the longest public execution in American history," unquote, according to Nat Hentoff. The young woman existed in a brain-injured state for 15 years before she lost the right to stay alive against the claim that her life was an offense to human dignity and not worth living. At the time of her death, 80% of the U.S. population said of Schiavo, "I don't want to live like that." In 1990, Schiavo collapsed from an unknown cause that resulted in severe damage to his cerebral cortex, but the base of her brain was left untouched. For the next decade and a half, she lived under the care of her parents and husband, absent prior brain functions, but breathing on her own, with no ventriculator or other medical technology to keep her alive, except for the feeding tube through which she received food and water. Her parents and husband came to a bitter disagreement about her continued survival. Her husband, who was the court-appointed guardian, filed suit to have the feeding tube removed, while her parents opposed any attempt to end her life artificially and prematurely, pleading to be given guardianship. Her husband refused, claiming that his wife would prefer to die rather than live in such a painful and diminished state. Once the conflict became public, the court case deciding Schiavo's life and death became part of a media circus concerning rights to life and death, abortion, end-of-life care, and other causes not entirely her own. The attention surrounding Schiavo produced a vast and largely contradictory set of images about her life capacities and circumstances. But one element remained consistent. Those who wished her death and those who opposed it wanted equally to avoid making her suffer, demonstrating both the association of pain with disability and how pain takes on contradictory guises to serve different ends. In Schiavo's case, more than any other seen here, the disabled person's suffering was presented as an affront to human dignity. Those in favor of Schiavo's death described her existence as a mockery of human life, as a mystical existence robbed of dignity, while those who sought to protect her described the efforts to take her life as an attack on human dignity. An effort by the state of Florida to pass legislation to save her was ruled unconstitutional, and the Florida Circuit Court later ordered that her feeding tube be removed and that no attempts be made to provide her with food or water by mouth. Carrie Schiavo was deprived of food and water at noon on March 18, 2005, and died 13 days later of renal failure caused by dehydration. On one side of the controversy, people felt that Schiavo had to die to preserve her humanity and dignity. Anna Quitland in Newsweek magazine opposed the publication of photographs showing Schiavo in her disabled state, writing that, quote, she should have been remembered for what she was, not what's left of her, unquote. Quitland claimed that, quote, the cruelest thing that we can do to people in Schiavo's condition is to force them to live, unquote. Arguably, no one has ever seen Schiavo to live since she stayed alive for 15 years without life support. But Quitland, like many other Americans, confused her feeding tube with a ventriculator, stating incorrectly that Schiavo was being, quote, kept alive by extraordinary measures, unquote. Ellen Goodman, a nationally syndicated columnist, denied that Schiavo should be called disabled because she was too incapacitated to merit the label, and I quote her, to describe Terry Schiavo as handicapped degrades the very term, unquote. According to these commentators in the courts, Schiavo's disability robbed her of dignity and humanity. For them, she existed in a state of suffering, perhaps severe, without the ability to communicate her pain to others. Compassion, humanity, and human dignity dictated that she be put out of her misery. On the other side of the controversy, media commentators made the case that Schiavo was not suffering and that putting her to death would be not only unjust, but also painful. Because she was not on life support, ending her life was not a simple matter of turning off a machine or pulling up blood. Putting her to death required extraordinary measures. In the case of capital punishment, the courts determined the method of execution, usually choosing the least painful one, although it is not clear what painless death sentence is. In this case, too, an act of violence was necessary if Schiavo were to stop living. But the courts could not rely on the usual methods of execution because she was not guilty of a capital offense. The legal defense to remove her feeding tube mimicked awkwardly the typical end-of-life choice to remove a dying person from a ventriculator, except that Schiavo was not being kept alive by her feeding tube, and she could not be expected to die within minutes as someone removed from a ventriculator could. That it took 13 days for Schiavo to die exposes the extremes to which the courts went in their quest to end her life. The fear of pain justifies irrational and often heinous acts against disabled people. These acts cannot really be defended on logical grounds, but they are understandable given a vigorous interpretation of the very real human fear of suffering. But no such fears seem to have protected Schiavo. While those calling for her death pronounced pain the ultimate enemy of humanity, they decided to kill her in the most brutal and cruel way to safeguard her human dignity. People from opposing political camps in the United States agree on very little, but they agreed in this case that Schiavo's death was horrific. Andrew McCarthy in the National Review, a conservative publication, called Schiavo's death cold-blooded murder. For McCarthy, the deprivation of water and food amounts to torture, and he noted that Florida anti-torture law, aptly called abuse, neglect, and exploitation of elderly and disabled adults, should have stopped the cruelty against Shiloh and placed her husband and the judge of the Florida Circuit Court under arrest. Stuart Taylor Jr., a liberal-leaning commentator, called Shiloh's death, quote, state-sanctioned death by dehydration, unquote. Matt Hentoff, a libertarian columnist writing in the liberal Village Voice, described graphically for an uncaring public the effects on individuals of death by dehydration, and I cite him. Their skin cracks, their tongue cracks, their lips crack. They may have nosebleeds because of the drying out of the mucous membranes, and heaving and vomiting may ensue because of the drying out of the stomach lining. They feel the pangs of hunger and thirst. It is extremely agonizing death, unquote. No criminal in U.S. history, many critics observe, has ever been executed as inhumanely by starvation and dehydration. Shiloh's situation was different for one reason only, and I cite Harriet McBride Johnson here. Well, it is Miss Shiloh's disability that makes her killing different in the eyes of the Florida courts, unquote. The fear of pain is often the beginning of oppression, but pain can also be the beginning of compassion. The test is not to dismiss compassion as if it were oppression, but to think about the difference between them. A difference not always easily and viably established, but one that needs to be attempted nevertheless, and so I'll give it a shot here. Oppression puts the life of one kind of person below that of another. It fits one person's life to another life by conceiving of that kind of person as pliable, manageable, and submissive, as an inferior life designed for service to another by that other. Compassion feels with the other person, granting this person's life value to all other, equal to all other lives. It places itself in the service of another life on the other person's terms, assuming the commitment to help this person find a life worthy of a human being. That is, a life at the heart of and embraced by other human beings. Not every disabled person is in pain, but all people in pain are disabled, and they face enormous oppression produced by the fear of pain. To speak in the name of pain is to feel for and with those people whose life risks above all others to be seen as not worth living, as undignified, as not human. It is to admit people in pain into the company of human beings with the assurance that human life will not suffer but prosper as a result. Martin Heidegger philosophizes that human beings only recognize the essence of human existence by confronting their radical finitude, the ineluctable fact that fragility defines each and every human life. Mustering technology to rescue ourselves from our vulnerability, he claims, only makes our existence as human beings more machine-like and less human. There is disability in the future of every human life, and as long as the conflict between life and pain stands unquestioned, pain will continue to produce fears about the future. Parents will turn to medical technology, such as the Ashley treatment, to rescue their disabled children from suffering, radically limiting the possibilities of their future life in the process. Other parents, gripped by the fear of pain, will cast the lives of their disabled children as wrongful, wishing they had never been born. Everyone will find new reasons to kill disabled people who are thought, like Terry Scheibel, to have no future because they live with pain. Thank you.
Thank you, Tobin. I'm sure I speak for everyone to thank you for that wonderful, thought-provoking talk, and my unwelcome job is a 10-minute response to a paper that deserves probably a book of responses. I'd like to shift focus a little bit from law to medicine. Simply listening to these hard cases convinces me that I made the right decision not to go to law school. But Tobin Siebers makes an important contribution in focusing our attention on pain among the disabled and the consequences of fears of pain. I did a quick check of publications from the International Association for the Study of Pain, which is the preeminent medical and scientific organization worldwide. They have entire books on pediatric pain, on pain in gender, and on pain in older persons. But I could find no title about pain among the population of the disabled. Now, the disabled, by definition, must differ in some way from non-disabled patients or persons. So from my own perch, which rocks unsteadily between medicine and English, I wanted to contribute just a few basic thoughts on pain and disability by pursuing a sort of general theme of differences. So one clear difference between English and medicine for me is that English departments think it pays to focus on language. So I want to share my favorite example from the 1986 Jim Jarmusch film, Down by Law, which includes an Italian tourist who likes to show off his knowledge of English by referring to the great American poet Bob Frost. If you're a native speaker, you know it's always Robert Frost, just as you know it's always Bob Hope. And there are just no rules to tell you about this. Words and concepts, like names, are always culturally inflected, and we learn from our different cultures and subcultures how to use them. Pain, which absorbed a long part of my life as a researcher, is one such complex and culturally inflected word. In my thematics of difference, then, I've got to make the embarrassingly obvious point that when we speak about pain, we're speaking in English. The English word comes wrapped in a history of usage full of specific and Anglo-centric myths, errors, and prejudices. We, or your patients, would be speaking of pain somewhat differently if we spoke fluent Navajo, or Mandarin, or Dutch, or Swahili, where pain, whatever its shared human neurobiology, comes wrapped in different traditions, histories, cultures, linguistic fields, and professional knowledges. Suffering is another complex English word, not easily defined, and not even always obvious as an experience, at least when it's someone else who's doing the suffering. People suffer in very different ways and on different occasions. In English, it's possible to drive a wedge between pain and suffering. If you stub your toe, it's legitimate to say you feel pain. It's not legitimate to say you were suffering. The renowned pain specialist and neurosurgeon John Lozier provides a diagram, which is in your handout, that makes a similar distinction between pain and suffering. In practice, however, suffering and pain are often mixed and hard to tease apart, like the whites and yolks in a plate of scrambled eggs. But medicine contributes another key difference in distinguishing between acute and chronic pain. Distinction almost never raised when pain enters the legal context. Acute pain, of course, lasts for only a limited time, say during a post-op recovery, and typically responds well to drugs, while chronic pain lasts without limit and often responds poorly to drugs. Drugs, in fact, often compound the problem, and before treatment, some chronic pain programs require a detoxification period in order to free patients from an accumulated witch's brew of prescription meds and OTC remedies. Another related difference involves a distinction between disability and impairment. Again, a brief example from my own background. Jim Abbott was a left-hander who pitched in the major leagues during the 1990s, and his achievements include a no-hitter for the New York Yankees in 1993. What makes it all especially remarkable is that he was born without a right hand. Jim Abbott was certainly impaired, but he did not see himself or wish to be seen as disabled. Impairment and disability can be thus inflected in very different ways. The differences between disability and impairment matter because disability in the United States is not just a life situation, but an official status. It comes with legal standing and political rights, often won at great cost by disability activists. Most important, in the U.S., certified disability status for pain can entail a cash payment. While many people disabled by pain clearly need this help, others just as clearly game the system for cash benefits. Workers' compensation claims for chronic low back pain prove such a costly social problem that one blue ribbon task force, unfortunately rather tone deaf, recommended that chronic pain in the absence of a lesion be denied further benefits after 6 months treatment and reclassified as, I love the air quotes, activity intolerance. The differences between disability and impairment are significant further because the medical literature indicates that disability payments for pain or even pending applications for disability status complicate treatment. Medical research in the field of pain beliefs shows that patients have worse outcomes if they believe they are disabled by pain. Pain belief studies also show that catastrophizing beliefs, say the belief that my headache indicates a brain tumor, correlate directly with quality of life. Such research strongly supports Tobin Siebers' argument that it's risky business to project onto disabled persons our own beliefs about pain, especially catastrophic beliefs that a painful life is not worth living. My thematics of difference implies that we need to pay close attention to the mix of different linguistic and cultural frames wherever we meet pain. Within medicine, pain calls for different responses in the ER, in the delivery room, and in the NICU, for example. A heavy pain in your chest radiating into your arm means something different than a hollow feeling around your heart after a romantic breakup. Pain signifies differently than in the hospital, in a court of law, in a courtship, and in a meatpacking facility. So too, suffering. It is precisely the differences that require especially close attention. And attention to differences as we consider pain among the disabled points to two main questions. The first concerns rights. What gives anyone the right to speak for someone else's pain? Such rights do exist, and I exercise them, in fact, as a legal guardian for my disabled wife who no longer can speak for herself. One disability rights activist titles his book with the slogan, "Nothing about us without us." It not only emphasizes the differences that mark some people as disabled, but also the ways in which language matters toward the goal of including the disabled in all key conversations and decisions about their pain. The second question concerns knowledge. Whose pain? What kind of pain? And in which cultural context? Medicine? Law? Journalism? Football? Tattoo parlors? Nobody owns the franchise on pain, and medicine can name almost as many different pains as roses, from aching visceral pain or the stabbing pain of post-herpetic neuralgia to the throbbing pain of migraine and the burning pain and burning neuropathic pain. We need to know not only who speaks for pain, but also which pain and in what cultural context. One final renegade thought on difference before we can move back to the law. Pain today in the West is almost inseparable from the knowledge constructed by medical research. Call it professional pain. People, however, also encounter pain in the wild. I call it unprofessional pain. Suppose you drive home tonight, click your garage door opener, and arrive face to face with an angry 500-pound Siberian tiger. Pain in the wild can be primal, bloodthirsty, and unpredictable. It doesn't come with a tracking device stapled to its ear or Siegfried and Roy. Pain is about as existential as you get, and if it gets you by the neck, so to speak, you know you're a goner. Language, especially where drugs fail, is sometimes all we have to respond to certain pain patients, disabled or able-bodied, whose eyes might remind you of a terrified and entirely pre-linguistic animal panic. Thanks.
I'd like to join David in thanking Tobin for his talk, which was very interesting and provocative. And I think he's exactly right to bring attention to the fact, as he says, that the fear of pain justifies irrational and often heinous acts against disabled people. In the presentation today, Tobin talks about 3 different situations in which societal understandings of pain or future pain of people or future people have been used to justify the conclusion that their lives are not worth living as they are. So those situations that he spoke about today were the story of Ashley's treatment, wrongful life lawsuits against healthcare providers when a disabled child is born due to negligence in prenatal screening, and the case of Terry Shiva. I would like to offer that thinking about these from a legal perspective adds a complicating factor. Even if one agrees, as I do, with much that has been written from a disability perspective, these additional legal dimensions make it difficult to know how best to proceed. Among the 3 situations, the treatment of Ashley X is the most straightforward, since treatment decisions for children and others who do not have decision-making capacity should be made almost exclusively on the basis of their best interests. Here, Tobin's analysis on what pain or suffering she may experience or not, and why it should or should not be used to justify drastically altering her body, is very informative. We might also ask whether the pain and suffering of her caregivers should carry any weight here, as Alice Drager does in the work that's cited in your handout for today. But the issue of wrongful life suits, recognized in just 3 states in the U.S. and largely rejected by the rest, have at least 2 additional complicating factors. First, when patients seek care and are provided with medical treatment that falls below the standard of care, in other words, negligent treatment, justice generally requires holding the negligent providers accountable in some way, both to compensate the victims of the substandard care and to deter negligent care in the future. But secondly, and more importantly, the parents in these cases were deprived of their right to make reproductive choices. The lawsuits known as wrongful life, which are brought by the child, this is in the U.S. what they're called, and wrongful birth, which are brought by parents, are only successful when women can show that they would have avoided or terminated pregnancy if given correct information about the likelihood of having a child with a disability, information that they sought. Women have a right to an abortion up to a certain point in pregnancy, and we get into very troubling territory if we allow the law to say that they can choose abortion for certain reasons, like concerns about financial responsibilities of raising a child, but not for other reasons, like disability of the affected fetus. So it seems to me that when parents are negligently given incorrect information that affects their right to make reproductive choices, there must be a legal remedy. At the same time, that legal remedy can be fashioned in a way that does not require parents to allege and prove for the wrongful birth lawsuits that they have been injured by or suffer from having and rearing a child with a disability, or to allege and prove for the wrongful life lawsuits that their children would have been better off never having been born. The issue of withdrawing life-sustaining treatment from people who are no longer competent to decide for themselves also has a legal dimension that complicates the question of the course of action society should take. That complication is the right to refuse unwanted treatment. In the U.S., people who have decision-making capacity have a nearly absolute right to refuse any unwanted treatment. And the law is clear that people who have lost decision-making capacity retain that right. The difficulty is figuring out how it can be properly exercised. For that, we generally turn to the stated preferences or probable preferences of the patient. For Terry Schiavo, then, the decision to remove her feeding tube was made after a court determined that that is what she would have wanted. You may disagree with the strength of that evidence, and I have questions about it too, but nevertheless, the legal basis for the decision is what the patient would have wanted. It is grounded in respect for autonomy, not a pursuit of someone's best interests. So how do we respect both autonomy and the rights of disabled individuals not to be discriminated against when a patient has made clear, when competent, that he or she would not want to continue receiving life-sustaining treatment in certain medical conditions? So how do we weigh these concerns about reproductive rights and rights to refuse treatment with concern that we're not engaging in discrimination against people with disabilities as those rights are exercised and honored? So even if we all agree with much of what disability advocates have to say about valuing all people, no matter their degree of ability or inability, or dependence or independence, it is not obvious how society should respond when concerns about discrimination on the basis of disability intersects with rights to reproductive choice and rights to refuse treatment. And I would love to hear Tobin's thoughts on that issue if you'd like to take that up.
My back with the audience?
Yes, you are, Tobin.
Thanks. Well, Lois says that the presence of law would introduce complicating factors, and it's not surprising to me that that would be the result of introducing law. It seems to do that. It's a very, very difficult issue you raise, obviously. And I think that the only thing we can really do is look at these cases. But I think that we need to look at these cases with full awareness of discriminatory patterns, which is what I was trying to do in this little paper, is to introduce a different way of thinking about pain, that pain itself could operate as a discriminating factor. I think in the case where there is, living wills and clear statements made about what one wants from one's future, that obviously autonomy has to be respected. But I think there are some other cases, and I think that Schiavo's is one of them, but I don't even want to say that it should have been, I don't even want to question the ultimate decision about that case. I have my own opinion about it, but I think that what is really interesting about the case is the way she was deprived from life and the meaning of that. That, in other words, that her status was such that it was not deserving of the kind of compassionate treatment that we would give to a criminal with the longest record of violent actions against other human beings. And I believe that that is part and parcel of the representations that surround disabled people. And we can find demonstrations of that in a lot of other cases. So for me, that's what's really important here, is that we begin to understand how the stereotypes around disabled people drive extremely discrimination against them, but often justify truly horrible actions. And that is still something that disabled people encounter, really on a daily basis, not only in the United States, but throughout the world. So that is something that is foremost in my mind when I think about the case of Terry Schiavo.
Great, thank you all three for wonderful and provocative presentations. We have a few minutes to turn to the audience, and I see a hand waving up in the back. So please, you've got them, okay. So
Okay,
please identify yourself and.
I'm John Harris. I teach philosophy here, and I work in the Center for Biomedical Ethics in the medical school.
It's on.
Is it on? Okay. I want to thank all three of you for really thought-provoking presentations. For the past 30 years, I've been engaged in a long and fruitful interchange with Adrian Ash, who is a good friend of mine, a blind advocate for the disabled and a bioethicist. She has taught me a lot about our society's treatment of the disabled and how we need to reformulate our views and our practices. That said, I want to raise an issue regarding the Shiloh case and try to resurrect this distinction that Professor Siebers rejected between the notion of disability and whatever condition Terry Shiloh was in, however we want to call it. As far as I understand her condition, and I'm not a physician, and I didn't even stay in a Holiday Inn last night, so I'm really in a hole here. As I understand her condition, on autopsy, her brain was almost completely liquefied. So she would have qualified, I guess, as a person in a persistent vegetative state. My understanding of the persistent vegetative state is that the person in it is beyond sensation. And I would argue is therefore beyond interest. In other words, they can't be harmed because the notion they can't cognize whatever is happening around them. So if that's true, then both many advocates for her death and many opponents of her death argue wrongly in basing their judgment on the presence or absence of pain. I would argue that she was beyond pain.
I take it that's for me. Well, it's interesting that you bring this up. I would argue that the death of Terry Shiloh resulted in a great deal of pain. If we want to define human life in terms of its dignity, in terms of its holding company among other human beings, then whenever we exercise brutal violence against a human being, we are exercising that brutal violence against the community. And Terry Shiloh's immediate community was her parents. And I assure you that the result of the Florida Circuit Court's actions created a great deal of suffering in them. David, there's another response here too. David Morris brought up a very interesting distinction between impairment and disability. That's a very important set of concepts in disability studies. Impairment is generally thought to be, refer to physical difference. So the case of the baseball player who was missing a hand, that's a really good example of an impairment. Disability is the term that is applied to people who undergo discrimination because of the existence of an impairment. By that definition, I believe that Terry Shiloh was disabled because of the actions that were directed against her. The very act of killing her, the way she was killed, would only be justified because she was considered disabled in the sense that her impairments registered as lack of human value, of that which against which any action could be justified. It isn't too long ago when we lived in a world where we believed, or some of us believed, that people of color didn't experience physical sensation, or that the mad didn't experience physical sensation, so-called the mad, or that infants didn't experience sensation.